The government have lost control of coronavirus and they've lost control of Britain. 7 days ago, for the first time in the pandemic, Britain recorded over 50,000 new COVID cases in a single day. The daily rate hasn't fallen below 50,000 ever since. Today, 58,000 people tested positive for the virus. In terms of the NHS, which we were told for months we were protecting, as we speak, there are already 40% more COVID patients in hospital than there were at the peak of the first wave, while daily admissions are already higher than spring and still rising. And now for the politics. The belligerence of the government enforcing schools to reopen has led to what, in effect, amounts to a wildcat strike by the teaching unions. The NEU advised their members over the weekend not to attend schools, which the union deemed unsafe workplaces, quite rightly. Many local authorities agreed, and so parents were left unsure whether to send their kids to school. It's a mess. But there might be a reprieve. After Nicola Sturgeon this afternoon announced a lockdown lasting until February, Boris Johnson announced he'd be delivering an address to the nation at 8 p.m. Will he finally, after being dragged kicking and screaming, introduce actual tough measures? That's what we expect. That's what's been briefed. And we'll be showing that announcement live at 8 p.m. Me and Ash will be providing some analysis immediately after. Ash, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. Happy New Year to you. First time I've seen you in 2021.
It's lovely to see, but I have to say most of the topics we're talking about tonight are fairly grim. But I suppose that's
we were just
20,
going to
20,
talk about. I thought we were just going to talk about like the last 2 days' hot takes about how it's problematic for men to fancy short women, apparently. And that guy who made his kid wait 6 hours to eat some baked beans. I thought those are the stories I prepped for. I don't know anything about this COVID schmovid.
2021 wasn't what it was all cracked up to be, much the same as 2020. I'll also be joined on tonight's show by Deepti Gurdasani, an epidemiologist at Queen Mary, to talk about some of those worrying numbers I've just described, and later by Chloe Tomlinson, a teacher and NEU activist, about the situation in schools. Aside from the pandemic, me and Ash will find time to talk about Donald Trump's fairly crass attempt to overturn the election result of the US election, and some rare good news about Julian Assange's extradition case. Some surprisingly good news there. For now, you know the score. Share the show link, tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky. We'll be checking the super chats throughout the show for questions and comments, so do keep those coming. Now, unless you're a Murdoch-employed talk radio host, or unfortunately for us, our Prime Minister until about 4 p.m. this afternoon, it hasn't been hard to comprehend that Britain is in an incredibly bleak predicament. A new record was reached today in terms of daily COVID cases. 58,000 were recorded across the UK in the past 24 hours. As you can see on this chart, in terms of the 7-day average of daily new COVID cases per million population, the UK's line is almost vertical. So it went from 230 to 773 people testing positive every day per million in the space of a month. The 230 was the 4th of December, 773 is today. The situation is even worse in certain parts of the country. So here I can show you another chart. On the left is the number of weekly cases per 100,000 people in each of England's regions. It is above 800 in the capital, meaning almost 1% of the city are testing positive every week. The percentage of tests that come back positive are even scarier. So that's on the right. That's what you can see on the right there. In London, 16% of those tested on December the 22nd received a positive result. Now, that was worrying because that was a proportion we hadn't seen since April. Yet by the end of the month, so by the end of December, that jumped to 27%, a level last seen in the middle of the spring wave when tests were only being carried out in hospital. So we're at the stage where more people are testing positive in our, huge hundreds of thousands of people being tested every day than when we were only testing people in hospital. Really, really terrifying stuff. It's also not surprising, given all of this is still a very dangerous disease, that this surge in cases is coinciding with a surge in hospitalizations, an unprecedented pressure on the NHS. So the following charts are all made by Christina Pagel of Independent Sage. We can see from the first one, there are now 40% more COVID patients in English hospitals than at the April peak. So you remember when we were talking about, hospitals ready to collapse? There were never more than 18,974 people in hospitals at that point in time. Now we've gone all the way up to 26,626. This is not just a bit higher, this is much higher. And what's most worrying is that we're way beyond that spring peak whilst cases are still increasing. So the number of daily admissions to hospital, this is people who are constantly adding to that figure I just showed you, that is higher than it was in the spring peak. So the most people who were admitted to hospital on one day in spring was 3,099. It's now at 3,145. That's how many people were admitted to hospital on the 2nd of January. One final graph for you, which is hospital admissions per region. And again, it's looking worrying in every part of the country, but especially in London, where you can see the gradient there is not something you want to see. I think we can get the regions graph up. Can we get that up? Great. So you can see that gradient, and with London, not something you want to see. And this doesn't just matter because, it's a city where lots of people live. It's bad if it's going up that steeply anywhere. But it's also that what's going on in London could be a portend for what's about to happen everywhere else. That's because it's in London and the southeast that the new, very transmissible strain became dominant first, and it's now dominant in most of the rest of the country. So what's happening in London now could quite easily be happening elsewhere within a week or so. Boris Johnson has presumably seen these graphs. He spoke to press at a hospital this morning.
We've got tough weeks to come now. It's clearly we've got, as you rightly say, we've got the virus really surging. It's vital, in addition to the tough tiering that we've put in, the further measures that we may very well have to take. It's vital that everybody now does their bit together.
On those further measures, this morning the Health Secretary said the old tier system is no longer strong enough. So what further restrictions will be put in place?
Well, I'm going to obviously ask you to wait, and we will be producing everything that we think is necessary to keep people from spreading the virus. If you think about it, we've already got a lot of the country in tier 4, some of it in tier 3. What we've been waiting for is to see the impact of the tier 4 measures on the virus, and it's a bit unclear still at the moment. But I think there's, if you look at the numbers, there's no question that we're going to have to take tougher measures, and we'll be announcing those in due course.
Spoiler: it was not unclear. He says, we need to look and see how it's going in tier 4 before we make a decision. London's been in tier 4 for 2 weeks, and I just showed you the data there. Anyway, I think when most people saw that clip, they were screaming, you are the person who has the power to introduce the tougher measures which you seem to think are necessary. Finally, something's happened this afternoon where he seems to have succumbed to that logic. As we've said already, we'll be showing you at 8 p.m. exactly what he announces, but we expect it to be a full lockdown, including the closure of schools. Before then, I'm now delighted to be joined by Deepti Gurdasani, a clinical epidemiologist at Queen Mary University, who I have to say, a thank you, because you've been incredibly informative on Twitter over the past few weeks. I keep going to your thread for often explanations of what are quite complicated sort of epidemiological papers being released by Imperial and the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. So thank you for, giving us your time to speak to us today.
No, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to, I was imagining that we'd be sort of getting you on to talk about how urgent and necessary a lockdown is right now, considering the news has now become that seems to be inevitable. It seems like that will thankfully be announced this evening. I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is, how much does all this dithering and delay cost us?
Yeah, I think that's something that we never talk about. It's very clear that the government has now repeatedly taken late action. This is at least the third time that's happened. And every time we do this, we talk about the number of lives saved, but we never talk about the cost of delayed action. So just to kind of give an example of what this means. So we know that there is, for example, a delay between when people are infected and when people are hospitalized and when they die. So because of that, the deaths in the next 4 weeks are largely what we consider baked in. So the people who will die, unfortunately, the next 3 to 4 weeks have already been infected. And the best way to prevent death is to prevent infection, because once they're infected, of course, they're hospitalized and treated, but there's, only so much we can do. And looking at the current rates of deaths, the prediction is that in the next 3 to 4 weeks, we will have between 20 to 25,000 people dying. And we can do nothing about that because action has been taken so late. The action that's taken now will prevent deaths probably in February. So we very, very sadly missed the opportunity to act early, although it's been clear for weeks and scientists have been asking for this for weeks. But once again, we've chosen to take incremental measures and wait and see whether they work when this is not the time to do that at all.
So, I mean, I suppose it's probably useful to compare the situation we're in now to the situation we were in March. So, in terms of the numbers of people in hospital, we're already in a pretty bad situation because there's more people in hospital already than there were then, and cases haven't started to fall. On the plus side, you might say we know how to treat it better, and there's a vaccine around the corner. But the big curveball for me, the big unknown, is that compared to March, we've got a more transmissible virus, which is dominant. So there are sort of suggestions that I've seen that suggest even if we have a March-style lockdown, the kind of lockdown Boris Johnson's about to announce, that might still not get R below 1, which could mean that we have, I suppose, 50,000 cases every day until the vaccine comes along. Or the vaccine is properly rolled out, I should say.
So that's exactly the result of missed opportunities. And before I talk about the variant, I do want to say that when we were talking about the peak of hospitalizations in April that you referred to, that was during lockdown. So that was a peak after lockdown. If we lock down today, hospitalizations will keep going up over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So it's not going to be 40% higher than the peak. Our peak is going to be much higher than the March peak because we're not going to be at the peak in the next few weeks. And of course, the new variant makes this really, really hard. And, it's no coincidence that a new variant has emerged in a region where we've let transmission go on at very high levels unchecked. We know the virus mutates as it reproduces. So we've kind of created the conditions for viral adaptation in the UK. The problem with this new variant is that it's between 50 to 75% more transmissible. And what's really worrying is that during the last lockdown, which was similar restrictions to, now except in tier 4, except with school, no school closures, the original variant was actually dropping, as you would expect with lockdown, with an R of 0.9, whereas this variant was growing with an R of 1.5, which is really high. So imagine cases rising exponentially in the midst of those restrictions. And that really highlights the difficulty with controlling this, even with strict restrictions in place. And I think SAGE documents also suggest this. We are very unlikely to be able to reverse the spread or growth of this variant and bring R below 1, which is why we're needing to, close schools now and move to remote teaching. But even with that, it's going to be really, really hard to bring cases below this level and turn it around. I mean, we don't just need to slow growth. We need to see cases starting to come down. Otherwise, we're going to, like you said, be in for tens of thousands more deaths. And vaccination is going to take a long time. And we can't really have that high rate of death going on.
And what's your take on the vaccinations? Because I assume, once this lockdown happens, lots of news coverage about this has been will he, won't he, when it comes to restrictions. I think that's going to now become, a non-question. We'll be in a severe lockdown. Then the debate will be about, I suppose, mourning the deaths, which we're going to see over the following weeks. And then also, how can we speed up the vaccination process? And one thing I wanted to ask is something that there's parts of epidemiology that I feel like I've got a bit of a handle on through this crisis, but this one I don't. So I've got no idea what the answer is, but I'm seeing sort of various experts on Twitter sort of question whether or not it's correct that Britain is sort of messing with the timescale of the vaccine program. So they've decided that whereas, most of the vaccines were tested on a first dose, then 3 weeks, then second dose, they've decided actually we can limit deaths if we give people one dose, then 12 weeks and a second dose. That means the maximum number of people will have had a first dose. Now, that seems sensible in terms of reducing deaths. I've seen certain sort of very eminent people on Twitter suggest that could create, ideal conditions for a mutant variant to emerge. What's your take on that?
Okay, so first question about vaccinations. So vaccines are definitely a very important part of the pandemic strategy, but they're not the whole strategy. Vaccine rollout is crucial And paying attention to that is very, very important. And there are many aspects to that. The logistics of rollout, the logistics of supply, the engagement with healthcare workers and people on the front line to understand the issues around this, and the engagement with patients regarding things like changes in dose protocol, which you were just talking about. I mean, the government has talked about a target of 2 million per week in terms of vaccination. We have approximately 22 million of people who are in priority groups. Vaccinating 22 million people with 2 doses at that rate will take at least up to June or July. Currently, we're not meeting this target at all. We're about 6 times lower than this target. And vaccinating just vulnerable individuals will take over a year. So we really need to pay attention to the logistics supply side of this and the rollout. Without that, it's very likely that this is going to take much longer than we expect. And there's almost no way that the pandemic will come to an end by Easter, as we are being told. The second issue about the difference in dosages and changes in protocol. I think what's really concerning is the way that this has been communicated and the way this has been done without much consultation clearly with people who are giving the vaccines, as well as patient groups who are very concerned about this. The reason this is being considered is simply because we're in a crisis. If we were New Zealand or if we were Australia, it's very unlikely these changes would be being considered because we would have the luxury of time. Unfortunately, with this new variant and where cases are now and the difficulty in controlling this, even with restrictions in place, we're in a position where thousands of people will die. And in the midst of that, there is an argument to be made that giving the vaccine to double the number of people, even if it's partly protective, is better than immunizing half the number of people fully. This is based on the data, for example, from Pfizer, where after 1 dose, the efficacy is in the range of 80 to 85% in preventing preventing symptomatic COVID. But of course, we don't know what that means for a larger gap, because that was not really studied in the trial. So having said that, most immunologists feel that it's very unlikely to decline significantly during that period and have supported this decision. But of course, it comes with many uncertainties. It's uncertain what this means beyond the 3-week stage. It's uncertain what this means in terms of transmission. And it's uncertain what this means for particular vulnerable groups like immunosuppressed patients, for example, where you would really want to study these changes in protocol. And it's also very uncertain in terms of what it means for virus adaptation. And as you said, there are concerns being voiced by virologists that this may create conditions for viral adaptation. And we have to essentially balance now the potential benefit of this against all these uncertainties and unknowns and decide what the best strategy is. And I don't have a clear answer to that. I mean, I understand the thinking behind the strategy. And I think if the strategy is followed, we need to really mitigate risk by conducting pragmatic trials of this longer gap to make sure we have data on what this means for people as well as vulnerable populations. We need to communicate this very clearly, take the public with us, engage with communities, involve patient groups, and very importantly, we need to keep surveilling for viral mutations and reduce transmission as quickly as possible to prevent the risk of escape mutations as much as we can.
I mean, that's the key here, isn't it? I mean, everything just becomes so much easier if we reduce levels of transmission, which is why, given that Boris Johnson was told days ago on the 22nd of December, by Sage, that we need a national lockdown with schools closed, why he has dithered for this long is just, unfathomable. It's difficult to get my head around what a disastrous situation he's put us in on every single vector here. Deepti Gurdasani, thank you so much for joining us. That was incredibly informative. Can I just ask, what's your Twitter handle? Because I do recommend all of our audience follow you, because the Twitter threads, especially about research which is going on, cutting edge research, I just find so informative.
Sure, it's D Gurdasani 1, and I apologize that that's difficult to spell, but you can look it up.
I retweet you all the time, so if they follow me, they can just press follow there. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
We are now going to talk a bit about the politics of all of this, because to me this feels a little bit like a deja vu. Boris Johnson has refused to take any tough action until it's way too late, over and over again throughout this pandemic. All the responsibility should fall on his shoulders, make no mistake. At the same time, it's not just Boris Johnson who has dithered and delayed over this. The opposition, the leader of the opposition, has also been somewhat guilty. Let's look at the series of positions that Keir Starmer has taken, and this is particularly with reference to schools. It's really pissed off teachers, really pissed off the teaching unions and many parent groups, and also, anyway, look, let's get to it. Up to this point in time, Keir Starmer has refused to commit to having schools being closed up to about 4 p.m. this afternoon, which we'll get to in one moment. So he's been saying we need to take tough action. Hasn't really specified what it would be until yesterday when he said we need a national lockdown. But in that national lockdown, he didn't say that schools would need to be closed, even though we know that SAGE have said that unless you close schools, there's no way you're going to get R below 1, even though SAGE have suggested that transmission is wider in schools. We've known for weeks that schools would have to close after this Christmas holiday. And he sat on the fence, right? I want to show you a tweet from yesterday. This is at 4 p.m. from Daniel Hewitt, who is a journalist at ITV. So he's been speaking to sources in Keir Starmer's team. He says, my understanding is Keir Starmer wants a national lockdown like November, not March. Tougher than Tier 4, closing more places. An example given is zoos, which are open in Tier 4, and bringing back the national stay-at-home message. Schools should be the last to close, says a senior source. Now, on one level here, the stay-at-home message is a good point. I think the fact that the government have been sticking to this tier system instead of having a proper national lockdown, one of the disastrous impacts of that decision has been that no one really knows what the rules are. No one knows what tier they're in. Everyone feels like it's changing all the time. If you just have this stay at home, we're in a national lockdown, let's all get through this together. That's so much better. So fair play to Keir Starmer then, even though it's only a day earlier, isn't it? The big problem here, though, is that why is he talking about schools? Who, when we've got 50,000 new cases a day, thinks that schools are the problem? Anyway, let's move on here, because the position changes in a way that it often does with Keir Starmer. I should also note Kate Green, so she is the Shadow Education Secretary. She went on TV this morning and again refused to back calls for schools to close. So that was this morning, today. Anyway, this afternoon, all of this became a bit of a side issue. Apparently I said schools instead of zoos. He said we should close zoos, not schools, until today. Right, we're going to go to a tweet from Robert Peston. At 3:04 p.m. this afternoon, he tweeted, PM, Prime Minister, will be directly addressing the nation. It won't be a press conference. Tier 4 restrictions will be imposed everywhere. Schools closed. No more team games in parks, but outdoor exercise will still be allowed. Now, the key point there, schools will be closed. So Keir Starmer said, we're not going to take a position on schools closed. Boris Johnson at 3 p.m., against all of his wishes and instincts, it seems, has said that he's finally succumbed to the reality that schools should close. Now, this, you couldn't really make this up. Less than an hour later at 4 p.m., this is tweeted again from Daniel Hewitt, who's a journalist at ITV. New. Keir Starmer tells me all schools in England should close as part of a new national lockdown. National restrictions need to come into place as soon as possible, and tragically, school closures have to be a part of that. Now, I've often said on this show that Keir Starmer seems to only want to announce stuff when it's inevitable it's going to get implemented anyway. So 20 minutes before Boris Johnson's going to have a press conference, he says, Boris Johnson needs to speak to the nation. He needs to have a press conference. But announcing it after Johnson has already briefed he's going to announce it to the press is, it's taking it to the next level. Anyway, I'm going to talk to Ash about this in one moment. First of all, if you think, the past 24 hours in terms of Labour's positioning has been tortuous, I invite you to watch this interview with Sam Coates of Sky News this afternoon.
It is inevitable that schools will have to close, and therefore they need to be part of the national restrictions package that needs to come into place as soon as possible.
So
which
schools and where?
Well, all schools are going to have to, inevitably, and this is tragic because nobody wants to close
from tomorrow?
Schools. Closing schools without a national plan isn't going to work. We need the two to go together. So national restrictions, not in due course, not in a week or two or three, but now.
So primary and secondary schools should close immediately.
Secondary schools are shut anyway this week across the country, and therefore we need to take action this week on national restrictions, and that needs to include schools. That requires...
all primary schools shut tomorrow?
Well, shutting schools without a national plan is not going to work. You need a national set of restrictions.
Why can't you give a yes or no answer to that? Shut primary schools tomorrow. Is that your plan?
You need national restrictions. School closures will inevitably have to be part of that. If that can be... I've said to the Prime Minister to get this plan in place today, but certainly...
I don't understand what your plan is. What do you need to do before shutting primary schools, and why can't that happen tomorrow? Why do you want to keep schools open?
We need a national set of restrictions. It is inevitable that closing schools is going to be part of that. It's going to have to be part of that.
But I don't understand what that means. How soon and under what, or if not, under what circumstances?
As soon as possible, we need the national plan in place. And if that can be done today or tomorrow, then we will support the Prime Minister in that.
Sage are begging for schools to be closed. Teachers are begging for schools to be closed. As we'll see in a moment, the public overwhelmingly back schools closing. Yet Keir Starmer still can't give a straight answer to a question on which he has the Labour movement, the public, scientists, everyone on his side. Ash, what did we do to deserve leadership like this?
What happened is that we got in a time machine and we went back to Ed Miliband's "These Strikes Are Wrong" interview. That's what happened to us, because it was that exact same issue, which is Keir Starmer's got his talking point, which is the national plan, similar to Ed Miliband's "These Strikes Are Wrong." And there is just absolutely no dynamism or responsiveness to what the actual question is that's being asked. Now, considering Keir Starmer is a QC, I'm going to discount the possibility that he didn't understand what was being asked of him. So for some reason, he thinks that it is not politically advantageous to answer this question of schools closing directly. And I think that this is a really profound misreading of the national mood. The whole way through, there have been, a broad public consensus for more restrictions, whether that was the first lockdown in March, when it came to even cancelling Christmas for Tier 4 just a couple of weeks ago. The public has generally been behind more restrictions, even if they felt very frustrated with the way in which those restrictions have been announced or indeed implemented. And so even if polling is telling you, two slightly conflicting bits of information, that schools being open is a priority, but obviously people want them to close now when it's not safe and they're driving community infection, Keir Starmer needs to be a more discerning reader of that mood and just say that. Just say, look, Sage says that schools have to close. That's got to be done ASAFP. The extra F is for feasibly. And that's nobody's first choice. I don't want that. You don't want that. It's bad for kids, but this is the position we're in. We've got to get the R rate down. That's first, last, middle priority. And that's articulating broadly the same set of things that he's trying to say about the need for a national plan, which also is one of those things which sounds great, but has absolutely zero content whatsoever. We need a national plan. Okay, what's in the plan? Is it going to be schools closing? Well, it's maybe part of the plan. It's so devoid of content. It sounds very action man. It's got, very little to back it up. And I don't see why Starmer is sacrificing a reputation that he could build up for himself of being, competent, foresighted and decisive to deliver a kind of car crash of garbled messaging like this. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm struggling to get my head around it. I don't know about you. To me, it seems like weird political decision making. Just say, yes, I think schools should close. I think it's sad that they've got to.
I'm just giggling because we just had a super chat from Michael Deary with £5. The timing of Keir Starmer's policy announcements remind me of that time Darren Brown predicted the lottery numbers after the lottery was done. It is the fact. Normally, at least he does it 20 minutes before it gets leaked, whereas today he changed his schools policy after Boris Johnson briefed Robert Peston. It was completely.
It's like ridiculous. In Mean Girls when Karen's like, "My breasts can tell when it's already raining." Like what we're seeing is Keir Starmer kind of squeeze the tit and go, "It's inevitable. Schools will have to close." And Sam Coates being like, "But do you, as leader of the opposition, think this should happen tomorrow?" And it's like, schools inevitably have to close. There's a 40% chance that schools are already closing.
I want to get some of the opinion polling up because, as you said, Ash, there the public are overwhelmingly right on this. Something that's been incredibly frustrating, as an observer of sort of the political response to this pandemic, is that the public have generally been much better at working out what is the best response to coronavirus than politicians of either party. So YouGov did a poll today. Do you think it is the right or wrong decision to reopen most primary schools in England this week? 22% said it was the right decision, 62% said it was the wrong decision. So this isn't a culture war issue. This isn't a 50-50 issue. 62% of the country thought it was wrong for Boris Johnson to push forward with the bizarre policy, the completely self-defeating, almost criminal policy to open schools this Monday. Only 22% felt that was the right decision. So why, as an opposition politician, you'd think you have to sit on the fence on that? I don't get it. I don't know. In terms of on the UK going into another national lockdown, to be fair, Keir Starmer did mention that yesterday. Again, a bit late, but it's not a national lockdown if you have schools open with this new strain. We know that. In any case, we can get up this next data. So in terms of the UK going into another national lockdown, support is 79%, and people opposed is 16%. So the support for a lockdown has dramatically increased. I mean, that's to be expected because the virus has become more and more serious. But again, people aren't being led here by politicians. They're being led by the data, but by witnessing, by looking at how catastrophic the virus is looking in this country and responding to it more sensibly than Boris Johnson can. And again, to sort of prove that the politicians are way, way, way behind the curve here, this is a poll from the 22nd of December. Would you support or oppose the UK going into another national lockdown? Support 71%, oppose 22%. And that support is across age groups. So 59% of 18 to 24-year-olds support it, 35% oppose. And 65 people who are 65 plus, 83% of people supported going into a UK national lockdown on the 22nd of December. So Keir Starmer's he's always saying, I've got to try and appeal to pensioners because they're overly represented in swing voters. Maybe then call for a lockdown. It's one of those ones where being opportunistic and wanting to win an election, which is fine, completely coincides with being on the right side of the argument, both morally and in terms of, properly representing the Labour movement. It just seems completely bizarre to me. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into schools because later in the show, as I've said, we're going to have Chloe Tomlinson, who is a primary school teacher who's been messed around a lot over the past few days, as all primary school teachers in this country have been, and secondary school teachers. So hold on to that. Hold that thought when it comes to being pissed off about this political class messing around students, parents and teachers. For now, we have 3,000 of you watching. Welcome to the show if you're new to it. This is our first proper show back in the new year. We've had 2 weeks off for Christmas, even though I think we did about 5 streams over that period of time because so much was happening. We go live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. and often for sort of, surprise streams if something very big happens. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notifications button. We have a non-COVID story now. Don't worry, we'll be coming back to COVID at 8 p.m. when Boris Johnson makes that announcement. But for now, on Tuesday, the state of Georgia will vote in elections that will decide which party controls the US Senate. But the state was in the spotlight for a different reason this weekend. That's because the defeated president still can't accept he lost the state's 16 electoral college votes back in November. Now, on Sunday, the Washington Post released a leaked phone call between Donald Trump and Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State. The call took place this Saturday. Raffensperger is the official responsible for overseeing elections in the state, which Trump lost to Joe Biden by 11,779 votes. Now, hold on to that figure because it's relevant later on in this call. First of all, let's listen to the first part of the call.
The people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
Now, do you think it's possible that they shredded ballots in Fulton County? Because that's what the rumor is. And also that Dominion took out machines. That Dominion is really moving fast to get rid of their machinery. Do you know anything about that? Because that's illegal.
This is Ryan, Germany. No, Dominion is not moved any machinery out of Fulton County. We're having
but have they moved? Have they moved the inner parts of the machines and replaced them with other parts?
No.
You sure, Ryan?
I'm sure.
I know this is a really serious issue, and people, like this is the president trying to mount a coup. Very, very serious. But have they moved the inner parts of the machines and replaced them with other parts? No. Are you sure, Ryan? I'm sure. I mean, it's tragic. Okay, let's go to the next part of the call. I told you, remember, that Joe Biden won the election by 11,779 votes. Well, won the state of Georgia by that.
You should want to have an accurate election. And you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have. Not even close. You're off by hundreds of thousands of votes. You know what they did, and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyers. That's a big risk. But they are shredding ballots, in my opinion, based on what I've heard, and they are removing machinery, and they're moving it as fast as they can. Both of which are criminal fines, and you can't let it happen, and you are letting it happen. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen. So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
So many elements of that call. So, I mean... I love the fact that he's trying to say you should be worried because you are now sort of overseeing fraud. It's your job to prevent fraud. Fraud's happened. Your lawyers should be worried. You should be worried that you're not taking this seriously. And then he asks for them to find precisely 11,780 votes, precisely the figure, so that he can win by one vote. Also worth noting, if he won the state of Georgia, he still wouldn't have won the Electoral College. So we'd have to pull this maneuver somewhere else in Pennsylvania, call up another Republican Secretary of State, and I suppose try and pressure them, bully them into. It's quite blunt, isn't it? Quite a blunt instrument. Say, I need you to find me more votes, any way or by any means that you can. Completely ridiculous. Quite lucky, actually, that I suppose the Republican Secretary of State pushed back. Someone's leaked that call. Ash, he's going out in style, isn't he, Donald Trump?
I mean, in inimitable style. On the one hand, it's quite worrying that a sitting president tried to subvert a democratic outcome of an election. That is an objectively worrying thing. And on the other hand, it's executed in such an objectively ridiculous, absurd, and kind of pathetic way that you struggle to muster up the kind of outrage and fear and kind of, political, energy that you would had it been any other president. Like, it's the way in which he has this total lack of self-awareness as he's speaking, which just has me hooked. So when he's saying the sentence, maybe they removed the inner parts of the machinery and replaced them with other parts of machinery. It's like when a child has cut its own hair and goes to its parents, and the parents go, "Did you cut your own hair?" And the child, because I did this a lot, has like some tufty, like chicken fluff on its forehead and is like, "No." Like, there's just zero self-awareness about what's going on. And it's like, this is plausible because I have thought it up. That is the reason why this whole sentence is plausible. And for that quality of a toddler to be in the cranium of a sitting president is kind of weirdly fascinating to watch. I can't condone it. It's obviously awful. The fact that this man had access to, a military which is capable of destroying the world multiple times over is terrifying. Also, it's kind of funny.
I mean, it is also, lots of people are saying, and I think this is quite right, that it's a bit weird in the American Constitution that you can lose a presidential election and then you get this 3-month period to do whatever you want without having any fear of, the electorate punishing you. So sort of lame duck period, or lame duck, I suppose, is when you're in your last term and you've done 2 terms. But Trump is using it to pardon all of these people, and to try and, I suppose, just shamelessly bully people into changing the election result. Which, I mean, he should have really been kicked out of the White House the day after losing the election. But the other thing this kind of makes me think is, I think your point about him being like a small toddler in the way he makes his argument is very true. Fundamentally, because you say it's like when a child says, "Oh, I didn't cut my hair," this tough to just. It's more like maybe I tripped over and landed on a knife. It's just sort of just making up these completely. But maybe there was something that was taken out of the machine and they put a different bit of machine in it. It's completely
it's
bizarre.
the way in which
and
it invites you to think that that's reality, right? There's this kind of. He's almost like Car from the Jungle Book, the trust in me snake. So he says it at this kind of weird pace, which is inviting you to share in this completely like batshit reality. And I know I probably shouldn't be analysing this through the lens of almost like character acting, but that's the only way you can look at it sometimes. It is this absurd character who, could still drop a nuke on us whenever he so chose.
In a way, that makes me feel like maybe we got off lightly. We had this sort of, because it's not just like this sociopath child in the White House, and we still, I suppose, there's a month left, but he still hasn't started nuclear war. Thank God. Make sure you stay tuned. At 8 p.m, we're going to show the Boris Johnson announcement. We're going to find out how we're going to be living for the next, I don't know. One of the things we don't know actually is how long it will be, how long the restrictions he announces will last. There's been suggestions it could be until February half term for schools. We'll have to wait and see. Also, before you do that, if you are enjoying this show, if you like Novara Media, if you love this show, if you watch it 3 times a week, even if you don't, it's only possible because of your kind support. So please do go to novaramedia.com/support if you haven't already, and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you do already, thank you so much. You make all of this possible. A British judge today ruled that Julian Assange cannot be extradited to the US to face charges of espionage. The judge had rejected arguments that Assange would not face a fair trial in the US, but blocked extradition on the grounds that US prisons would not be able to prevent him from taking his own life. Now, that's obviously quite a bittersweet victory. It doesn't seem like necessarily, this great defense of free speech, but nonetheless, it is a reprieve. It's not all rosy, though, for Assange, not only because, this assessment of his mental health makes it sound like he's, in a very, very difficult place, but also because he's still not a free man. Lawyers representing the US government are expected to now appeal the decision to try and still get him to overturn the decision of the judge so they can get him extradited. And Assange remains in custody in Belmarsh prison. Assange's partner, Stella Morris, addressed supporters and the press after the ruling.
Thank you for coming. I had hoped that today would be the day that Julian would come home. Today is not that day, but that day will come soon. Yeah. As long as Julian has to endure suffering in isolation as an unconvicted prisoner in Belmarsh prison, and as long as our children continue to be bereft of their father's love and affection, we cannot celebrate. We will celebrate the day he comes home.
So, I mean, obviously it would be really tragic. You've heard this case where someone's saying this person is so clinically depressed they can't be extradited, but yet we're going to keep them in a high security prison still. Something doesn't seem quite right there. To discuss what this case means, what this ruling means, what it means for Assange and for investigative journalism, I'm delighted to be joined by Naomi Colvin, who is UK and Ireland Project Director at Blueprint for Free Speech, and someone who I understand, because I've spoken to you about it a few times, you appeared in our Assange documentary. You've been following this case for a long time now, right?
This is true.
Could you talk me through the ruling? I've given a very crude basic outline. The judge essentially rejected all of the arguments of the lawyers when it came to sort of saying he won't face a fair trial or that he's just a journalist, but did accept the argument that it would be, a risk to his life to extradite him.
Sure. So there's a couple of points I want to make here. The first is that it's a really important win today, actually, and Julian has won on the same basis that Larry Love won his extradition case back in 2018. So it's really that precedent which has won the day here. Now, in terms of all of the arguments that put forward, the defense put forward lots of different arguments. You're right about the political motivation of the case and the free speech aspects and whether it would be a danger to investigative journalism, which it is. A lot of these are totally novel arguments in an extradition setting. So I think the sensible way to think about this ruling is that the judge decided that he shouldn't be extradited and chose the least politically contentious way of doing it. Most of these issues that the defense put forward are really issues for an appeal court rather than a first instance ruling in first instance judge in any case. She has ruled importantly in Julian's favour on the territory which you would expect her to deal with every day. So that's health and evidence about prison conditions. And she's basically accepted the defence case on that. That means that this is a strong ruling for Julian, which an appeal court is kind of going to be reluctant to revisit her findings of fact on this issue. So it's really good for him.
Interesting. I hadn't taken that on board. So basically the questions about investigative journalism were potentially, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, above the judge's pay grade. They were like, I'm going to take the easy way to stop this extradition. And if the US government want to appeal, they can have that argument in a different court. Which leads me to the question, are the US government going to appeal?
Yeah, I think they probably are going to appeal. And I mean, obviously, I don't know. This is just speculation. But what I would expect them to do here is they can only really appeal on the medical stuff. And as I've said, there's going to be a presumption that this judge heard all of the medical evidence. She's in a good place to assess the credibility of various witnesses. So an appeal court is not going to sort of dig back into which witness said what. But what the US is probably going to do here is they're going to come back to the court and they're going to say, look, so the first instance judge basically ruled in our favour and everything else and said this is very serious, it's criminal behaviour, it would be criminal behaviour in the UK, which is all very problematic actually, and we should talk about it. But so you've said that there's a suicide risk, but we can mitigate that, and we're going to give you certain assurances about the conditions that Julian would face if he were extradited, and well, how about it? So look, we've sorted out the problem. Of course, there's a long history of US assurances not really meaning to UK courts not really meaning very much. So all of that is going to come up at appeal, I would expect.
And am I correct that actually Jeffrey Epstein, that case was brought up because they were saying, if you're saying you can stop people committing suicide, what happened to Jeffrey Epstein? I mean, the whole world was watching that.
Exactly. And, how do you answer that? I mean, and again, this is exactly what happened in Larry's case. In Larry's case, said you can't, it's horrible to talk about this in this way. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I hope this doesn't sound flippant or whatever. I'm just talking about the nonsense way in which this is dealt with in the legal system. But in Lowry's case, I mean, the court basically said, well, you can't stop him. You're not going to be able to stop him killing himself. And in fact, the measures you put in place to stop him killing himself are going to actually exacerbate his health situation. And what they've said in Julian's case is that the prosecution left it open that Julian would face the very worst conditions that the US criminal justice system has to offer. That's special administrative measures, which means total solitary confinement wherever you are, and imprisonment in ADX Florence in Colorado, which is like their supermax prison. And the ruling does talk about those conditions. So I think it's possible the US is going to come back here and say, well, we say he's not going to turn up there. Of course, there's lots of evidence and precedent for the US saying these things to UK courts and not following through at all.
And what is, I know you've sort of said it's probably the case that the judge is just looking for the easiest way to stop this extradition, not necessarily the easiest, but the lowest common denominator way to stop this extradition. But what does it say to journalists, I suppose? So say someone leaks to me loads of information and I'm weighing up whether or not I should publish this information, which is very embarrassing for the British or the US state. Do I have to now think, looking on at this, I'm either going to get extradited to the United States or I'm going to have to be driven to such a point of sort of depression that a judge believes that I'm, it's a risk to my own life if I were to be transported to a US prison. It's a very bleak sort of situation, a bleak choice. I know this isn't a choice, but do you know what I mean? Whereas either you get extradited or you're so depressed they can't guarantee you're not going to kill yourself.
So the short answer there is yes. I just want to make a couple of points. So the first is, I think we should all bear in mind how extraordinary it is that the least politically contentious way of stopping something like this is for a UK court to rule that US prison conditions are so crap and so below any reasonable minimum standard that people die in US prisons. I mean, let's just recognise that for a second, because it's happened twice in the past 3 years now. Further than that, it is not the case that this court ruling has any precedential value for UK journalists because it's a district court ruling in an extradition case. However, it is probably an accurate assessment of one, where the law is now, which is in a terrible state as regards the Official Secrets Act. And there are opinions which the judge is making here, which I find quite troubling, not least the idea that large leaks of large contentious document sets, which is one of the most powerful innovations in journalism over the past 10 years, can never be considered responsible journalism under Article 10. That was an extraordinarily contentious thing for her to have said, in my opinion. Now, when we're talking about the Official Secrets Act situation, the present legal situation in the UK is terrible. The one safeguard we have, which isn't present in the US has issues with prosecutors being able to do whatever they like. The safeguard here in the UK is that the Attorney General has to sign off on any prosecution under the Official Secrets Act before it happens. Given who the Attorney General is now and the complexion of the current government, you may not find that a particularly reassuring safeguard. I don't think I do. And there are tensions running either way. So obviously this government has very much moved in the direction of complete impunity for members of the intelligence services behaving illegally. There's covert human intelligence sources law as well, which is also pretty troubling. On the other hand, and interestingly, this was released just before the evidential hearings in USA versus Assange in September. The Law Commission, not a political body at all, technocrats have, or lawyers, but, technical lawyers have completed a review of the Official Secrets Act. And rather surprisingly to me, came back and said, well, the Official Secrets Act as it stands, in the way that the judge has looked at it in Assange's case, is no longer compatible with Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and it needs to be changed in order to add a public interest offence. Now, I would suggest to you and to your viewers that this is something which is really worth fighting for in 2021. Basically, the lawyers, the legal analysts agree that this should happen, and in the area that I work in, which is in whistleblower protection, we've been playing with these precedents, and we've established new laws on the European level to try and protect whistleblowers. So the policy opportunity is there. We just have to work with or pressure a recalcitrant government to sort it out. So there's a real opportunity there.
And finally, we heard Stella Morris there, Julian's partner, say that she's not going to celebrate until he's released from Belmarsh. I know he's asked for bail. I think also the Mexican president's offered asylum. Is Julian Assange going to be free from Belmarsh or from prison anytime soon?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm somewhat pessimistic about this. He has a bail hearing on Wednesday. This is the best situation you could hope for him to be granted bail. However, there's been a strong presumption against granting him bail because he was in the embassy for many years. I don't agree with that reasoning, but that is the reasoning of the British court, and I think it's the reasoning which is pretty common within the legal system of England and Wales. The pessimistic view of this is that, and certainly I imagine this is the attitude of the current government, is that he's outstayed his visa, they will keep him in Belmarsh on some form of immigration detention and then just fly him to Australia at some point in the future. Justice would better be served by him being out of Belmarsh, obviously, and he's had a horrible, horrible, horrible time there after a horrible, horrible, horrible 7 years, or however long it was, in the embassy, in which he, I saw him deteriorating significantly, and it was awful, 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 awful. I guess I guess I'm not an optimist on these things, but then I was proven wrong today, so maybe I should revise my views.
That's probably that's a positive note to end a very mixed
you have
conversation.
To understand, it's like very, very rare to have anything good happen in this situation at all. I'm in shock. I was actually writing an analysis of what this ruling meant when I was just saw it come out that that they were talking about, and I was like, how, really? No way. But yeah. So it's a good day overall.
Yeah, appreciate it. Enjoy it. Naomi Colvin, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Cheers.
We are now, we're kind of waiting for Boris Johnson to start speaking to the nation. That's going to be in a couple of minutes. He'll pop up when that happens. Don't worry, you'll be the first to see Boris Johnson going live. I know that's exactly the kind of things you're at the edges of your seat to wait for. Whilst we wait for that, Ash, I was going to put a question to you. Rod L. Miller
Aries
with $5.
With a Scorpio moon and a Leo rising. I hope that answers your question.
How it's slightly different, although thanks for I'm sure Rod L. Miller will be appreciative of that information also. How much do you want to bet that Julian Assange will be pardoned by President Trump on January the 6th? I don't quite know why the 6th. I suppose it's after the Georgia Senate race.
So my guess is that unlikely. So if you think about all of the really awful stuff, which has, happened to Chelsea Manning under a Trump presidency, not wanting to look weak on issues of national security, I'm not necessarily certain that there will be a presidential pardon for Julian Assange. I obviously hope that there will be. My position on the Julian Assange issue has always been that extradition to the US is just pure punishment, to criminalize him for putting information into the public arena, which is oppositional to US geopolitical interests. So yes, I do really hope that there's a presidential pardon. But yes, like Naomi, I'm not convinced that it's going to happen. I don't think it's that likely. But like Naomi, in the sense of I'm a pessimist who wants to be optimistic.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think the only hope is because he's a bit like a toddler. The only reason he'll do it is because it will piss off some people in the Democratic Party, which is probably not the best motive to pardon someone. But in this case, it would lead to a just outcome. Natalie Pearl with $9.99. Thank you very much. Thanks for all your work to shed light and make sense of the workings, in brackets, failings, yes, more likely, of this government and opposition. Kept me and my partner sane for the last year. Solidarity. And solidarity to you. I'm very glad we've helped you keep your sanity through this incredibly difficult year. Ash, we're going to hear Boris Johnson in about a minute, I think.
The whole United Kingdom has been engaged in a great national effort to fight COVID. And there's no doubt that in
we've got Boris Johnson now.
Variant of the virus, our collective efforts were working and would have continued to work. But we now have a new variant of the virus, and it's been both frustrating and alarming to see the speed with which the new variant is spreading. Our scientists have confirmed this new variant is between 50 and 70% more transmissible. That means you're much, much more likely to catch the virus and to pass it on. As I speak to you tonight, our hospitals are under more pressure from COVID than at any time since the start of the pandemic. In England alone, the number of COVID patients in hospitals has increased by nearly a third in the last week to almost 27,000. And that number is 40% higher than the first peak in April. On the 29th of December, more than 80,000 people tested positive for COVID across the UK, a new record. The number of deaths is up by 20% over the last week and will sadly rise further. And my thoughts are with all those who've lost loved ones. With most of the country already under extreme measures, it's clear that we need to do more together to bring this new variant under control while our vaccines are rolled out. In England, we must therefore go into a national lockdown which is tough enough to contain this variant. That means the government is once again instructing you to stay at home. You may only leave home for limited reasons permitted in law, such as to shop for essentials, to work if you absolutely cannot work from home, to exercise, to seek medical assistance, such as getting a COVID test, or to escape domestic abuse. The full details of what you can and can't do will be available at gov.uk/coronavirus. If you are clinically extremely vulnerable, we're advising you to begin shielding again, and you will shortly receive a letter about what this means for you. And because we now have to do everything we possibly can to stop the spread of the disease, primary schools, secondary schools, and colleges across England must move to remote provision from tomorrow, except for vulnerable children and the children of key workers. Everyone will still be able to access early years settings such as nurseries. We recognise that this will mean it's not possible or fair for all exams to go ahead this summer as normal. The Education Secretary will work with Ofqual to put in place alternative arrangements. We will provide extra support to ensure that pupils entitled to free school meals will continue to receive them while schools are closed, and we will distribute more devices to support remote education. I completely understand the inconvenience and distress this late change will cause millions of parents and pupils up and down the country. Parents whose children were in school today may reasonably ask why we did not take this decision sooner. And the answer is simply that we've been doing everything in our power to keep schools open, because we know how important each day in education is to children's life chances. And I want to stress that the problem is not that schools are unsafe for children. Children are still very unlikely to be severely affected by even the new variant of COVID. The problem is that schools may nonetheless act as vectors for transmission, causing the virus to spread between households. Today, the United Kingdom's chief medical officers have advised that the country should move to alert level 5, meaning that if action is not taken, NHS capacity may be overwhelmed within 21 days. Of course, there's one huge difference compared to last year. We're now rolling out the biggest vaccination programme in our history. So far, we in the UK have vaccinated more people than in the rest of Europe combined. With the arrival today of the UK's own Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the pace of vaccination is accelerating. I can share with you tonight the NHS's realistic expectations for the vaccination programme in the coming weeks. By the middle of February, if things go well and with a fair wind in our sails, we expect to have offered the first vaccine dose to everyone in the 4 top priority groups identified by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. That means vaccinating all residents in a care home for older adults and their carers, everyone over the age of 70, all frontline health and social care workers, and everyone who is clinically extremely vulnerable. If we succeed in vaccinating all those groups, we will have removed huge numbers of people from the path of the virus. And of course, that will eventually enable us to lift many of the restrictions we have endured for so long. I must emphasize that even if we achieve this goal, there remains a time lag of 2 to 3 weeks from getting a jab to receiving immunity, and there will be a further time lag before the pressure on the NHS is lifted. So we should remain cautious about the timetable ahead. But if our understanding of the virus doesn't change dramatically once again, if the rollout of the vaccine programme continues to be successful, if deaths start to fall as the vaccine takes effect, and critically, if everyone plays their part by following the rules, then I hope we can steadily move out of lockdown, reopening schools after the February half-term and starting cautiously to move regions down the tiers. I want to say to everyone right across the UK that I know how tough this is, and I know how frustrated you are, and I know that you've had more than enough of government guidance about defeating this virus. But now, more than ever, we must pull together. You should follow the new rules from now, and they will become law in the early hours of Wednesday morning. Parliament will meet largely remotely later that day. I know that the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland share my conviction that this is a pivotal moment, and they're taking similar steps. The weeks ahead will be the hardest yet, but I really do believe that we're entering the last phase of the struggle, because with every jab that goes into our arms, we are tilting the odds against COVID and in favour of the British people. And thanks to the miracle of science, not only is the end in sight, but we know exactly how we will get there. But for now, I'm afraid you must once again stay at home, protect the NHS, and save lives. Thank you all very much.
The old slogan's back. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It was the best one they had. It was when the brief period where their policy seemed half coherent. Ash, I should apologise because we interrupted you quite abruptly there when Boris Johnson went live. I think you were almost mid-sentence, which is probably a live streaming no-no. But the announcements there. So he was saying people should begin shielding. Every time he mentions shielding, I'm so annoyed because he's saying people who are extremely clinically vulnerable. We've had 50,000 new cases a day. You're saying they should only now shield? I think probably they've been shielding already. They just haven't had the support to help them do it.
We just remembered that you were there.
Exactly. It's like in that press conference when they asked, when someone actually called up and said, I'm vulnerable, I'm clinically vulnerable, I'm shielding, and I'm being asked to go to work. And he was like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. Like, well, that's what the employer's allowed to do because you've only just reintroduced the shielding policy that you thought existed this whole time. Idiot. But, those announcements in general, that's a relief, isn't it? He's going to close schools and secondary schools, so primary schools and secondary schools for this whole half term. We're going back to stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. The main critique is that this could have happened 2 weeks ago, could have happened 3 weeks ago, and we would have saved a hell of a lot of lives. Also, I suppose the narrative arc of that announcement was unsurprising to say, look, you have to have some bad stuff now and then you'll have some good stuff in the future, which is the vaccine and which is the way out.
Well, look, let's talk about the three good things in there. Three good things in there are this mid-February target to vaccinate or give a first dose at least to the top 4 priority groups. So over 70s, those in care homes, everyone who's clinically extremely vulnerable, and frontline health workers. That's a good target, and I think that with our famously ferocious fourth estate, the government will be held to account properly if they fail to meet it. Another good thing on 2 issues. One is the continuation of free school meals, which I think would be unimaginable if not for the pressure piled on this government by Marcus Rashford on making sure that there is still free school meal provision to those children who need it when they're not in school, and getting on the front foot about this issue of examinations, because what happened to GCSE, NVQ and A-level students over the summer was absolutely atrocious. They had their futures just swiped from them, poorly thought out algorithm, and it was really incredibly distressing. So hopefully they'll come to a better solution this time around. So those are 3 things where you go, okay, Boris Johnson has learnt some lessons. In lots of other areas, you can just sort of see this insane story that they expect us to believe, that only in the past 24 hours this government realised that schools were vectors of infection. Sage advised that schools should be closed on the 22nd of December. We've known that schools might be a vector of infection for quite some time. That's why we closed them in the first lockdown. It seems that this government expects us to believe that they've only just learned all the stuff that we've all been talking about for weeks. And when I'm talking about we all, I'm not just talking about, me and you, Michael. I'm talking about people who aren't that politically engaged, people who aren't, doom scrolling Twitter, 24 hours a day. Most people thought, hang on, this is kind of sucky. This doesn't add up. So I think that there's an issue with Boris Johnson trying to make what he's saying sound intuitively true and honest, because it's not. What he likes to do is take things down to the very last minute and make a decision when some decisions are taken away from him. It's what he's done with Brexit. It's what he's done throughout this pandemic. And being a kind of last minute Larry, it doesn't cut it when you're trying to govern in the middle of a public health emergency.
I mean, people said it was damaging with Brexit in terms of, imposing costs on businesses, not having the certainty of knowing what particular deal we'd be in, or whether we'd have a deal on the 1st of January. But this just takes it to the next level. I mean, taking decisions at the last minute when you have no possibility, when literally there's going to be, the whole scientific establishment is about to literally revolt, right? If you wait until that point, that's incredibly bad, very, very dangerous, actually deadly. Leadership. If you're interested in the sort of criminology of this kind of stuff, what's happening within the halls of power, Tom Newton Dunn, who is at Times Radio and is a very bad journalist, actually. He sort of published a conspiracy theory about many left-wing journalists, but does seem to have quite good connections to people in Downing Street. He tweeted today, "You couldn't blame some ministers for a bit of I told you so today. I hear senior cabinet members met last week. Matt Hancock and Michael Gove argued to follow Sage advice and close schools until February. Gavin Williams plus others persuaded the PM not to." Now, obviously, the names that stand out there, Gavin Williamson, the worst education secretary. I mean, in history, you could not have made more mistakes with no achievements to your name. But obviously, the person who has the real blame here is the Prime Minister. He was persuaded by Gavin Williamson instead of Sage. What does that say about the man's character? One of the groups of people who will be most affected by the announcement that Boris Johnson just made there are teachers. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Chloe Tomlinson, who is a primary school teacher and a member of the National Education Union, and wrote a great article for Tribune a couple of days ago on why schools just have to close. I suppose in a way, well, first of all, thank you for joining us on tonight's show. I'm sure you've had a stressful few days.
I have. That's really stressful day, but nice to be here.
Is it lovely to have you? Is it a relief to hear Boris Johnson make that announcement there?
Is it a relief? I don't think that they had literally any other choice now. A lot of schools haven't opened today, despite having been told to. The government have basically lost control of our schools in the last 4 days. Huge numbers of individual education workers have invoked Section 44 to say that they will not return to teach full classes because it's not safe, but they're available to work from home or to educate key worker children in school. And lots of schools have then closed because they've had teachers writing in, and that was kind of an implicit agreement between the head teachers union and the NEU. So I'm not surprised. The government's catching up with where education workers are at, to be honest, and where scientists are at. But it's good that they're now agreeing with us.
It's good, but they don't deserve a pat on the back for it. Could you describe to our audience what difference it's made for you as a teacher that this announcement was made today instead of on the 22nd of December when Sage recommended it?
Yeah, a huge difference. So, I am at least in I'm in a school in London, so I at least knew I wasn't going back to the 18th of February. So we had a few days' notice. But it was, last time was stressful. Teaching in a pandemic is really, really hard work. You're covering for a lot of absent colleagues. You're having to deal with all sorts of different issues. And it was really hard over Christmas. Christmas got cancelled, and then just constant uncertainty. You check sort of like education Twitter, which is where teachers go to chat about their geography lessons or whatever else it is. And there were so many teachers who were wanting to plan for the term, because we plan in advance, we get everything ready for our lessons. You need to do that for lessons to be any good. And we were planning for online lessons, we were planning for lessons in school, and we didn't know, and lots of us did plan to be back in school in January and then have had to go back and redo that work. I had a remote inset day today, and the sort of leadership are frantically trying to go through our online learning policy, our online safety policy, get us up to scratch with all the systems for online learning, which is a lot to get your head around. And they're frantically trying to sort out rotas. In my school, the rota they sort out has some serious problems in it. So we've spent all day as a union group trying to respond to that and get issues there addressed. So it has been really unnecessarily chaotic and stressful for teachers. And as is always the case when the government messes up these issues in education, who loses out most? It is the young people who we work with. So yeah, it's not been a good time for head teachers. It's not been a good time for teachers, and it's not a good time for students either.
And the rotas issue there is because you're going to have some teachers still going into school to look after, or to care for, to teach children who are vulnerable or who are children of key workers, whilst other teachers are doing remote teaching. Presumably, you've still got this sort of division of labour that's going on there that duplicates how many people you need. I want to talk a bit more about the experience of children here. Obviously, everyone, when they say we don't want to close schools in principle, no one wants to close schools in principle because it is better for kids to be in school. But now we're in this situation. This was inevitable. It should have been announced 2 weeks ago. When I say inevitable, saying it's inevitable doesn't mean that you don't have to have a position, Keir Starmer. Anyway, can you tell me a bit about how you expect the experience to be for children over the next 6 weeks? In that announcement from Boris Johnson, there was sort of, some nudges about we're going to try and give kids laptops. I was reading on the weekend that still like millions of households who don't have laptops when we're just about to go into remote learning. He's, trying to suggest that will happen now. How confident do you feel that you have, the structures necessary to deliver a proper education remotely to your students? And I mean, do you expect that or do you hope that there'll be sort of laptops arriving at their house in the coming days?
I mean, it's a good thing that Boris Johnson has said he's going to give out more laptops. It was a very, very vague, I don't even think you could even call it a commitment. But the government have completely failed to deliver on their promises around resources for home learning throughout this pandemic. And it is absolutely key. I don't even know if children in my class have a pair of scissors at home, let alone any sort of device to access the internet. In fact, I know lots of the children I work with won't have that, or will have really poor quality internet connection, so they won't be able to access any videos or anything like that. That is, I mean, in terms of learning, that is a huge problem. And what you would have hoped opposition would be doing throughout this is, given that it has been a given that education will be disrupted in a pandemic. We've had bubbles bursting and children being sent home throughout the last few months. It was always obvious that there needed to be a much better offer for resources for home learning, and the government have completely failed to deliver on that. And I think it would be wishful thinking to really believe that's going to change now. But I'll be pleasantly surprised if it does. I mean, I think also I do think it's important to say here that when we talk about the impact of the pandemic on children, we talk a lot about the impact of them not being in school, and I do think that's really important. But I also think that we need to pay a bit more attention to the impact of being a child at a time when coronavirus cases are this high, of the stress and anxiety that causes their families, of the impossibility of them seeing their extended family, of them seeing grandparents. Many of them, will have lost family members and friends and stuff. And I do think, we can't treat the impact on the disruption of schooling as the only element to which children are struggling in this pandemic.
No, I think that's really important. And again, I mean, I suppose that will be. Do you feel like that's your responsibility as a teacher to try and do that remotely, or should the government be coming in? There are going to be kids who are now feeling emotionally isolated, and it is, beyond sending them a laptop, which is the bare minimum that this government should be doing and has absolutely failed to do. How do you think that emotional support can be provided for students? And I'm going to get Ash to chime in as well with a question in a moment. So we'll bring up her on screen. But yeah, if you could answer that question about sort of emotional support.
Well, I think in a way it's the case to like address the pandemic as well and as quickly as possible, and to stop separating the idea that you can teach children in a bubble while there's a pandemic raging on in the outside world, which doesn't work in terms of transmission, but also very clearly from my interactions with children this year, and I teach very young children, just how, that they've been absolutely lovely. They've been so happy to be in school. It's been really genuinely like wonderful teaching them. But I've probably never taught children who are so emotionally needy. And I think, if we care about children, yes, we care about having them in school, but we also care about addressing this pandemic. We also care about a whole host of other demands, such as access to outdoor space and to community spaces, to making sure their parents have, resources that they need as well. And you can't just sort of like separate off the needs of children and think if you get them into school, everything will be fine, because how children are doing has a lot to do with how their families are doing, and a lot to do with the sort of the wider societal picture. And it has frustrated me how much has been left out of this debate, which has so often been reduced to schools being open, schools not being open, and this sort of like absurd no ifs, no buts position where you end up completely reducing it to that and actually missing out a lot of the really, really important stuff that's going on around children.
Ash, I want to bring you in. I know you've got lots to say on this issue.
Yeah, I feel like long time listener, first time caller. You've got this kind of like Tysky sandwich thing going on. I'm so sorry for that. So the question that I wanted to ask you was about this issue of vulnerable and at-risk children. So children who don't necessarily come from the most stable backgrounds, children who might be considered looked after, i.e. they're subject to a child protection plan. One thing that I've heard from friends of mine who work in child protection is that there hasn't always been great uptake of school places from some of those at-risk young people, in particular once you start getting into teenage age. And one of the things which a social worker friend of mine said to me was, I've got kids saying, well, I'm not going to go in school because then everyone's going to know that I come from, in their words, a shit family. So what do you think could be done either on the part of teachers or social services and local authorities, or indeed central government, to get uptake of those places better, particularly for those quite vulnerable older age groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because it is exactly the same in primary. A big concern in the first lockdown was that it was really the middle class parents who were really keen to get their children back in school. And I think, yes, that might partly be to do with the self-consciousness around the status of being vulnerable, but it's also a lot to do with how immune middle class people have felt to the virus throughout this pandemic. And that was a really frustrating element of the debate that was completely missed out around the sort of like June reopening schools debate, which was, I was having conversations with teachers in Tower Hamlets who were saying, I'm from one of these disadvantaged communities, and everybody I know, all of my family members, including sort of nephews and nieces and stuff, are terrified to leave their homes. They definitely do not want to be going back into school. And so I think it is a really important thing. I think that I actually don't know if it's going to be as relevant now. I think we'll have to wait and see, because I do think that the fact that we have all been back in school for ages has completely changed people's relationship with being in school. And I think actually there is more uptake of key worker and vulnerable children places now than there was before. But I mean, I think the answer is to find ways of educating that are sustainable in a pandemic. And that isn't necessarily always about having children in school. That also should be about, I mean, even things like having, I mentioned this to Michael the other day when we were chatting on Twitter, but like, I can see a world in which I teach half my class in the morning and the rest are outside doing activities with support staff and like extra PE coaches and things like that. And then we switch over. I think there's so many avenues that can be being explored. And a lot of that is through the politics around all of this, which is basically, a combination of government just being completely inept and cruel, and Keir Starmer being incredibly short-sighted, has just meant that there's not really been any space for the kind of nuance and compromises, like the ifs and the buts, that actually educating right now requires. So yeah, I'll have to see.
I mean, there was also a political question that I wanted to ask you, which is, it must be frustrating to see the same people who were in favour of austerity policies, which cut education budgets, cut local authority budgets, disproportionately impacted on deprived households and families, now turning around as like the guardians of deprived children and going, get them back into school. It's all you middle class lockdown lefties who want to see them out because you're not the ones affected. Is there something in there which is like making your jaw clench a bit?
I think a lot. I think at this stage that has not come up as much as it did in the summer, but like that really infuriated me. Like it was just maddening. But I think what's interesting there, and again, this is something that's a little bit under discussed around Keir Starmer, because it's often assumed that he's sort of chasing popularity. And I'm not saying there's no element of that, but I think there's two different brands of obsessing over the impact of lockdown on deprived children. I think one of them is like a completely insincere, Tory ministers who have never cared at all about disadvantaged children, invoking them in order to get their own way and conceal the fact that they want this purely for economic benefit. I do also think the other one is a reflection of the strength of the sort of like strong grip that the myth of meritocracy has on many centrists, and this idea that I think there is something British about it, about social mobility and about the fact that if for some people, for people perhaps like Keir Starmer, if you care about poorer people and you care about poorer children, then you care about schooling, because what they need is a state institution that will come in and that will sort of like save them from that poor family, that background, all that like impoverished childhood experience, and will come in and inject all this like middle class culture and really get them out of there and rescue them. And I think that's one of the reasons for me why even Michael, your position throughout this has really failed to see that yes, schooling is important. Like, I'm a teacher, I love teaching, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't think it really mattered. But it's not like a magic fix. It doesn't. You can't just like take society's problems and be like, well, you know what, we'll send these children to school and then everything will be okay, because like, it's not how it works. The whole problems that are going on here can't just be separated from the issue of schooling and addressed, and then everything will be okay. Like, it would actually be a much better strategy for children to really, really, really pursue a zero COVID strategy, so that they get to have their childhood in a time where there's not this absolutely appalling pandemic that we're obviously reliving in this horrible way right now. And of course, like, let's do things to take the edge off how awful lockdown is for them, and part of that is about being in school, but a lot of that is about them getting to be around their peers, them getting to be outside, them getting to leave the house, things like this. It's not always about them getting the school curriculum delivered in a classroom, although that is one very, very, very important element of it.
I think this is almost an invitation. I swore I'd never do it, to come out with my most Tory education opinions, because oh my god, I've got like so many Tory education opinions, it's unreal. One of them, non-hierarchical learning, never bought it. 2, the Oxford tutorial system, I think it's actually pretty good. But 3, I actually do agree with you on this stuff about school being more than just what's taught in the classroom. It's opportunities for children to socialise, to have a sense of self that they develop away from the family. Like, all of this stuff is really important developmentally, and it can't just be reduced to reading, writing and arithmetic. You can't separate it from quality of housing and access to resources at home. But Tory opinion is that I do think get the little feckers in a classroom.
Yeah, I agree.
That's my Tory opinion. I'm not pro-caning.
Also, a zero COVID strategy was never going to happen. A zero COVID strategy was never going to happen in this country. So you either have the kids waiting at home until you have zero COVID, which would have been until we have a vaccine completely rolled out, or you try and make schools as safe as possible.
No, but
and
I
also,
disagree with
I
you
want to
as
bring
well
up a
there, Michael.
Oh, okay.
No.
We're going to have to wrap up very soon, though. Every time someone
no,
disagrees, we have to respond.
No, I'm ready to fight everybody. I'm going to be like
Okay.
you with your hippy dippy education stuff. No, get them facing the front of the board. Michael Walker.
I think I was more into that. I think it's really important.
This isn't a debate show.
I don't think it's like worth the situation we're in right now. I think we could have rosters, we could have had compromises. I think it would have been much better for them to be in class every other week, to be in class for half a day. I just think we've overdone the importance of them always, and what they're doing in class and things like that. Like, it's not like the fact exams have been cancelled is really important. It will give us space to teach the stuff that actually they need to make up for the time they missed. A 2-week half-term holiday, that would not have mattered. That would not have mattered. Where we are now is much worse. Months of children being cooped up in their homes without any escape is really gonna be bad. And it didn't need to be this bad if we had been able to just make some sensible compromises around schooling and not fixated on that. That's what I'm saying. I do think.
Okay. All right, so we're not going to get into child-led learning shit, man, because that's when I'm like,
Yeah, we'll do a longer debate show on this. This is Tysky Sour. It's not a debate show. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Right.
We're going to go to a couple of super chats, which, to be honest, is mainly covered. Alexandra Barnes with a tenner. The compulsion to keep schools open strikes me as ideological rather than for the benefit of children, but looking forward to those kids that need them getting laptops and broadband. In terms of how ideological it is, I think that was probably covered in the past 10 minutes. Maya Freeman with $4.99. I'm from Ecuador and have lived in England for 18 years now. It's my birthday today and I'm celebrating watching your program, which I love. Happy birthday, Maya Freeman. Apologies. We're very honored to have you spend your 18th birthday watching this show. Ash Sarkar, it has been a pleasure being joined by you this evening. It's great to be back after the New Year holiday.
You really brought in like the inner reactionary in me. I don't know how you did it. Like, I think it was the combination of like, Michael, our resident social democrat, and then Chloe taking like a much more radical position, particularly on zero COVID. I was like, well, you know what? Now it's time. I'm going to say that I like the Oxbridge tutorial system. I like kids facing the front. I don't believe in non-hierarchical learning. Like, these are some of my most Tory opinions.
I've got loads of Tory. Well, actually, I've got loads of New Labour opinions on education, but we'll go into those another day. Chloe's heard about all of those in her Twitter DMs. You have, for now, been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Please do like the show. We've had lots of you watching tonight, and it does help us with the algorithm if you smash that button. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.